I will let PPM. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Fair Housing Alliance virtual briefing titled Introducing the Purpose, Process, and Monitoring Framework for AI Fairness. My name is Michael Akinwumi, and I'm the Chief Tech Equity Officer at the National Fair Housing Alliance. I lead a team that works on fulfilling the 5 goals of the organization's Tech Equity Initiative. It is my pleasure that I am hosting today's event. We want to know that this webinar features information and examples that represent the experiences of the speakers. Comments do not necessarily reflect the policies of National Fair Housing Alliance. Before we get started, let us review some technical tips and instructions regarding today's event. If you are having technical difficulties, please sign out of the webinar and sign back in. If you are still having trouble, you can request help in the Q&A box located on the Zoom panel section at the bottom of your screen, or send an email to techequity@nationalfairhousing.org. We encourage you to ask questions. You can enter your questions at any time by selecting the Q&A button on the Zoom panel. Please note that due to time constraints, we may not be able to respond to every question today. This webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours and is being recorded. The recording and the transcript will be made available on the NAFA website, along with resources that supplement today's conversation. We have 6 speakers for this event. Each speaker would introduce themselves and mention their relationship to NAFA when it is their turn to speak. So we're going to have opening remarks from Lisa Rice, followed by basics of AI and machine learning, then followed by landscape of AI auditing, and followed by why AI auditing is a requirement in housing. And after that, we're going to have 3 speakers speaking on each of the components of the PPM framework, and that will be followed by Q&A, 20 minutes for question and answer. With that, I am now going to hand it over to Lisa Rice, President and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance, to give us opening remarks. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks so much, Michael, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we review a new auditing framework for algorithmic and data-driven systems. The Purpose, Process, and Monitoring, or PPM framework, was developed under the National Fair Housing Alliance's Tech Equity Initiative by our Tech Equity team, which is led by Dr. Michael Akinwumi, who you just heard from. Under our Tech Equity Initiative, we are seeking to eliminate bias in the technologies that impact our lives. The TEI was born out of work that NAFA has undertaken over the past few decades to increase fairness in our housing and lending markets, including efforts to address insurance and lending redlining, as well as discrimination related to the marketing and advertising of housing and credit products on digital platforms. We've made great strides under the Tech Equity Initiative, including developing comprehensive comments and responses to regulatory rulemaking. Please visit the Tech Equity Initiative page on our website to access the various comments that have been submitted. There, you will find other resources to help expand fair access to housing and credit opportunities. Ensuring that systems used in the housing and financial services space are fair is paramount for our society. Technology affects every area and aspect of our lives. It is up to all of us, fair housing groups, regulators, academicians, researchers, housing providers, financial services providers, civil rights groups, and consumer protection organizations to ensure that the systems we use to make critical decisions about people's lives are accurate, transparent, explainable, and non-discriminatory. The purpose, process, and monitoring framework is one tool to make sure this happens. It represents the gold standard for auditing algorithmic models, including machine and AI systems. I thank you again for joining us. And with that, I will turn things over to Kareem Saleh.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Kareem Saleh. I'm the founder and CEO of Fair Play. We are the world's first fairness as a service company, and we serve as advisors to NAFA on tech equity and algorithmic bias issues. I'm delighted to be with you this morning to share a quick conceptual introduction to machine learning. If I could trouble Madeline or someone to queue up my slides, please. Great. Next slide. So what is machine learning? In traditional programming, you can think of traditional programming, computer programming, as taking a set of ingredients, much like one might use when making dinner, applying a formula in the same way that one applies a recipe to ingredients, and producing, and the combination of those ingredients and that recipe producing an outcome, represented here by a pizza, right? So ingredients plus recipe equals pizza or outcome. Next slide. But what happens if you don't have a recipe? Sometimes we go to a restaurant, we order something off the menu, it's delicious, and we want to replicate it at home. And we can kind of tell what the ingredients are, and we know what it's supposed to look like at the end, but we don't know how to make it. We need a recipe. And fundamentally, that is what machine learning allows folks to do. It allows you to take a look at an outcome, like a pizza, as well as its variables, and discern the function or the recipe that yields that outcome. Next slide, please. Where is machine learning being used in housing today? Well, we're seeing machine learning being used in housing in a number of high stakes decisions. One place we're seeing machine learning be used is in tenant screening. So for example, you may fill out an application to rent an apartment, and the landlord may try to figure out the recipe or the function for determining if this tenant will be successful in the property. And so one place that we're seeing machine learning being used in housing is in tenant screening. Another place we're seeing machine learning being used in housing is for mortgage loan underwriting. So you've applied for a mortgage and the lender wants to figure out, are you going to pay back the mortgage? And machine learning can help us understand what recipe or what function we should use to determine if someone is going to pay back their mortgage. Finally, another area that we've seen machine learning being used in housing is in home appraisal. For example, you're buying a house. The lender requires you to have the house to be approved, have the house to be appraised. And machine learning is used to assess how should this house be valued. Next slide, please. Let's dig a little bit into that middle example of loan underwriting. It used to be that mortgage underwriting was done by humans, represented here by this loan officer. And it used to be that prospective home buyers would go to a lender and sit across from a loan officer, and that loan officer would try using his own recipe or his or her own algorithm to determine if you were going to pay back your mortgage or not. Of course, we know that having humans make those kinds of decisions led to terrible disparities in our housing market. and trusting humans to make housing decisions left us with a legacy of redlining, which we'll show on some maps later. Next slide, please. So in the 1980s, rather than relying on human beings to make decisions about who should get a loan and who shouldn't, lenders started using new forms of mathematics to make lending decisions. And that was regarded as a positive development, because the thinking was that math is seemingly more quote unquote neutral or seemingly more objective. And let's give you an example. Let's give an example of how that math purports to work. So what you can see here is a decision tree that represents an algorithm for mortgage loan approval. And you can see that the algorithm starts by assessing a person's credit history. You can think of that as the ingredient from the pizza recipe outcome slide, right? So the first ingredient the math looks at is a prospective applicant's credit history. Is their credit history good? If it is good, you follow the fork in the decision tree and next look at their income. Is their income low or high? If an applicant has a good credit history and high income, you can see that the math suggests that they be approved for a loan either in a small or a large amount. Whereas if the applicant's credit history is good, but their income is low, you can see that the math suggests that the applicant be approved for a small loan amount, but not a big loan amount. On the other side of the decision tree, if an applicant's credit history is bad, the math then looks at the next ingredient, income. And if their credit history is bad and their income is low, you can see that the math suggests that the applicant not be approved either for a small loan or a big loan. Conversely, if an applicant's credit history is bad, but their income is high, you can see the math suggests that they be approved for a small loan, but probably not a big loan. Next slide, please. The problem with this math, as I've just described it to you, is that it assumes that there are these straight line relationships between things like credit history and income and whether or not you should be granted a loan. And you can see that that math assumes what's called linearity, straight line connections between variables. And you can see that represented here by the dots on this chart. So blue dots represent applicants who paid back their loans. Red dots represent applicants who defaulted on their loans. And if you can only separate good applicants from bad applicants by drawing straight lines or by assuming straightforward connections between ingredients, sometimes called linearity, you can see that making linear decisions leaves some blue dots on the side of the line where folks are getting declined, and it leaves some red dots on the side of the line where folks are getting approved. So assuming linearity, assuming straight line relationships between ingredients results in some people who ought to get credit not receiving credit, and some folks who ought not to receive credit being awarded credit. Next slide, please. But we know, those of us, that the real world is complex and non-linear, and that you can't always assume straight line relationships between ingredients or between variables. We need a mathematics that does a better job of separating the red dots from the blue dots, a mathematics that allows for the existence of nuance in the world. And that is effectively what machine learning does. Rather than identifying these straight line linear relationships, it attempts to identify what are sometimes referred to as non-linear relationships, relationships that are more complex than a straightforward connection that a human might assume. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about how non-linearity works and how machine learning can identify these non-linear relationships. Imagine for a moment that we were trying to build a model or an algorithm that predicts sex. Can we, and let's say that we were in our effort to predict sex, that I was going to give you height as an ingredient or as a variable into that algorithm. Well, height is somewhat predictive of sex because men on average are taller than women. Next slide, please. But of course, height is somewhat predictive of sex, but it's not perfectly predictive of sex because as we all know, there are short men in the world and there are tall women in the world. So using height alone is not going to yield a very accurate algorithm for predicting sex. Next slide, please. So what if I said, okay, in addition to height, I will also give you weight as an input into your algorithm? Well, weight, in addition to height, does add some predictive power to our algorithm because men, even at the same height, tend to weigh more than women due to testosterone levels and bone muscle density. So height was not perfectly predictive. We added to height weight, and our predictive power got a little better, but it's not perfect. Why? Let's see on the next slide, please. Well, every algorithm that seeks to predict sex on the basis of height and weight will misclassify every child as a woman, right? So height and weight are somewhat predictive of sex, but they're not perfectly predictive of sex. So how can we improve the predictive power of our algorithm further? Next slide, please. Well, what if in addition to height and weight, I gave you birth date, right? So you could control for the fact that there are children in the world. Knowing people's age eliminates the misclassification of children and improves our model's accuracy. But if I had told you at the beginning of this story that birth date was predictive of sex, most people would have said I was crazy. But that is the power of machine learning, to find these nonlinear relationships that are not immediately intuitive, right? Machine learning can understand that the combination of height plus weight plus birth date can encode information about sex. Next slide, please. Now, when we had three variables, height and weight and birth date, we could kind of understand that nonlinear relationship and how those three variables together encode information. But what if you have many variables, so many variables that no one can understand, no human could look at all those variables and understand them? Next slide, please. We sometimes refer to that as the black box problem. The black box problem is the issue of not understanding how an algorithm or a model makes its decisions. I can see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly through the next few slides. Next slide, please. And what is the risk of the black box? The risk of the black box is that it will be biased in ways that we do not understand. Let me give you one example from an auto lender we've worked with in the past. This auto lender was a used car lender, and it had one of the variables that it took into account in its model was, what is the mileage of a car that is proposed to be purchased by the car buyer? And that is kind of intuitive as a credit signal, because the higher mileage of the car, the more likely it is to break down. The more likely a car is to break down, the more likely its owner won't get to work. And the more likely a person is not able to get to work, the more likely it is that they will default on their auto loan. So mileage of a car seems to have a reasonable connection to creditworthiness. Another variable that was in this lender's model was, does this applicant live in Nevada? It turned out that applicants from Nevada tended to default on their loans at higher rates. Maybe it's because of Nevada's long history of gaming, which makes Nevadans more risk-seeking. Maybe there was something going on macroeconomically in Nevada, but for whatever reason, Nevadans defaulted at a slightly higher interest rate. So this lender had these two variables in their model. What is the mileage of the car that is proposed to be purchased? And do you live in Nevada? Those are both facially neutral variables. They don't obviously discriminate against anybody, right? Next slide, please. But it turns out that if you're buying a high mileage car in Nevada, there's a big probability that you are a person of color, right? So the reason that we worry about the black box quality of machine learning is seemingly fair variables can interact in ways just like height, gender, and birth date to encode information about an individual. And in this case, what mileage and living in Nevada was encoding was, are you a person of color? So a model that seeks to make predictions on the basis of the mileage of the car you're buying and whether or not you live in Nevada is actually making decisions about whether or not you're a person of color or a woman. Fundamentally, machine learning is this ability to discern a recipe where you have an outcome and variables, but you don't know how the two connect each other. When you have a lot of variables, that recipe can be hard to discern or understand. We call that the black box. And the reason we fear the black box is that the machines will be making decisions on bases that we object to from a policy perspective and from a legal perspective. I could go on for hours, but I think I'm at time. Thank you very much. This has been your conceptual introduction to machine learning.
Thank you so much, Karim, for covering such an interesting topic within the short time given to you. And I hope now that, each time any member of the audience actually thinks of ordering pizza, they can actually use your analogy to come to a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about AI, machine learning, or even any algorithmic systems. So I will hand it over to our next speaker, Alex, who is going to introduce himself and then also speak on the algorithmic auditing, why we need to audit algorithms, and how it's currently being done. Over to you, Alex.
Hi, everybody. I have some slides I can share in just a second, and we will be off to the races. Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Engler. I am currently joining you from Brussels, but very happy to be here. Normally, I work at the Brookings Institution studying AI governance, but I'm on a quick leave of absence to study the European approach. And before this, I was a data analyst and data scientist in social science institutions like the Urban Institute and in government. I can't stop for your questions during this, but I love questions and I will happily answer them if you drop them in the chat, and I will respond to you in the chat after or during the Q&A later. So feel encouraged to do that or reach out however else you feel comfortable. I'm going to talk a little bit about the why and how of algorithmic auditing. Karim set us up really beautiful to understand the framing of machine learning and algorithms and the problem of bias. And when we talk about algorithms, we shouldn't understate the degree that they're being used. In many important human services, we're seeing algorithmic proliferation, not just in mortgages, but also in enrollment management. This is an industry term for who gets into college and how much tuition they pay. And that has boomed as an industry and is closing in on being universal. In hiring, the percentage of Hiring processes that use predictive analytics has been growing continually. Financial services, I thought this was striking. 98% of mortgages originated by Quicken Loans come from their digital platform. That I thought was striking. And also in areas like healthcare and healthcare allocation, which not only we've seen proliferation of this type of algorithm at many steps, but also some of the same racial biases. And so we'll talk about a couple of these examples. So we did just hear about this, sort of what is machine learning, but I want to talk about some of the characteristics as a person who encounters them too. So one important one is that they operate at scale. This is to say that it is worth building one of these algorithms if you're going to use it a lot. It is not worth putting the time in to develop an algorithmic service just to use it for one person, right? So you're almost always assuming that building these is going to affect many, many people. They're automated, and this is pretty simple, but it usually is replacing a process that was done by a person. Sometimes it's a totally new thing, but most of the time it's either replacing or augmenting the role a person was doing. So again, hiring, setting tuition, offering, mortgage denial or setting loan terms. In some sense, this is taking something that's done by a person and moving it towards a computerized approach. We just heard about the black box, absolutely a common challenge here. It obscures the decision-making process from a person engaging with it. This has the downside of it just maybe harder to learn about what's going on. We'll talk about that problem in a second. And we're also going to talk about how it affects civil liability. How do you sue when you don't know what's happening? They might be consistent in treatment. This is true sometimes, but they're often not in impact. And I just have a little chart here. We just saw an example of a decision tree, and a decision tree is a type of algorithm. You can see this tree here. And even when it's true that everyone is being treated the same way, right? They're all going through the same algorithm, or they're all going through the same algorithmic process. That doesn't mean they're getting impacted the same way. It very much means you could end up at a different part of this tree, right? So sometimes people, again, as Greenwich is telling us, say that they're neutral or unbiased, but that is not true. And we knew that for many examples. And then lastly, these algorithms frequently can learn, machine learning sometimes, right there in the name. And that means the algorithmic behavior may change over time. All of these are going to affect how we think about auditing and how we think about the problems that come out of algorithms. Okay, so what are our concerns? Big picture, there's a series of concerns that this is probably incomplete. I would love to hear from the NAFA people and our other guests about what I'm missing. But here are some of the big concerns when you take algorithms and you bring them into these sort of key important human services. One is that they're power centralizing. And this is pretty straightforward. Most of these algorithms are data dependent. They only work if there is lots of data, and institutions hold most of this data. Most individuals aren't collecting massive amounts of data on their own, and so they don't have lots of opportunities to use algorithms to improve their influence or improve their knowledge of a situation. A good example of this is when universities use algorithms to set tuition, they are getting an asymmetric information advantage. The students that are applying to that college don't know more because they have access to algorithms, but the institutions, the colleges do. This is also true for ride-sharing apps, for instance, right? Where they know tons about their drivers, and the customers, maybe they don't know much more now that they're using Uber than they did before. So power centralizing towards data or organizations that have data. Sometimes they incentivize privacy violations. This is especially true in common examples around facial recognition. Clearview AI and Everalbum both massively broke privacy norms to collect huge amounts of data to make their algorithms go. Opaque processes may offer no feedback. Well, sure, this may come up, but if you are denied a mortgage or if you don't get a job, if you do that with a person, you might get more feedback. They might explain to you, it was this that we didn't love about your background, or it's your down payment that wasn't high enough for this type of mortgage that you applied for. In the default in algorithmic systems is not necessarily that you get that. And there's work here in interpretable or explainable machine learning, but it's not guaranteed that you get that feedback. A fourth is fraud. This is simply that people just overstate the claims about what algorithms can do. It is unfortunately very common, and hopefully we're seeing some pushback there from our agencies. And I'll just note that it's different than efficacy. It's not the same thing as saying this algorithm doesn't work. It's that the promises are far beyond what the algorithm can do. Discrimination, this is a big one. It exists in many of the algorithmic circumstances I've talked about. This is maybe not completely fair, but I think broadly you should assume that if an algorithmic process is not examined for discrimination, that it is probably there by default. I think that is broadly fair. That's not always going to be true, and it may be less discrimination than there was in a previous process. There's certainly quite a bit of discrimination, the former process of credit approval, for instance, and in hiring, but that we shouldn't assume that it's better. We should do the math, we should look intentionally, and we should use the broadening proliferation of algorithms as an opportunity to make things better when we can. And lastly, I'll mention systemic risks. Systemic risks often when algorithms are working together or whole industries are changed by algorithms. Online markets have algorithmic risks if they start accidentally colluding, which may be possible. And less theoretically, we've seen the stock market crash by dropping thousands of points because different algorithmic behavior surprised other algorithms and they all sold stocks rapidly before then buying them back. That's the kind of thing you worry about with systemic risks. Unpredictable behavior when there's many algorithms working in a system. But we're here to talk today about a proposed solution, algorithmic audits. So what are they and what can they do for us? An algorithmic audit is a review of the entirety of an algorithmic system, or at least it should be, and I think that's what we're going to hear from NAFA in a little bit. It's a review of the environment, where does this algorithm operate, what goes into it, its inputs, its functions, what does it do specifically, its outputs, what does it produce, and then the results, meaning how do those outputs use to then sort of affect the environment that it's in. An algorithmic audit is supposed to be a holistic review of all of this, and notably, it actually requires that the system is going on. It's hard to do, or most definitions of an audit don't include algorithms that don't yet exist or haven't yet been deployed. Typically, you could quibble with this, but typically we call that preliminary analysis an algorithmic risk assessment. And that's when you evaluate what might happen if you use an algorithmic process. And it's different from reporting. Reporting might be, hey, we have this algorithm system. Here are a small number of metrics about, this is what it predicts for, on average, this is what it predicts for African Americans and versus Caucasians and Hispanics. This is what it predicts for men and women. You might see that reporting, right? But that's different than an audit. An audit is really about getting into the full pipeline and examining what it's doing. This is what we're going to hear from NAFA about. The Purpose Process Monitoring Framework is an example. But there are many examples of from healthcare and hiring and education and social media. And there are some general frameworks, but they are being adapted specifically to their environments as well. And then finally, usefully in our case, they can be paired with some sort of outcome. This can be just the fact that they produce public transparency. An audit can be useful if it simply explains what an algorithmic system is doing. But it also can be paired with a fine or penalty for illegal activity, which we are starting to see in a few cases, and possibly algorithmic deletion, which is to say this algorithm is really illegal. We've seen this mostly for algorithms that were built with illegally collected data. You have to delete the data you collected and the algorithm itself, and you're not allowed to use this. So it can be paired with real penalties. Okay, so to understand a little more about what an algorithmic audit can do, let's talk about those original problems and how an algorithmic audit can help. So does it help with power centralizing towards institutions? Honestly, mostly no. Might create public awareness. You might better understand how you're interacting with an algorithm, but probably not. Does it produce privacy violations? Yeah, if the privacy violations are illegal, right? If you learn by the process of going through an algorithmic audit that some data is being used beyond what it was the criteria under which it was collected. So possibly it might prevent illegal privacy violations. Does it help with opaque processes that don't offer feedback? Not really, unfortunately. Audits are going to give you this broad explanation of how a system works, but it's probably not going to help you as an individual really understand it, or not realistically for most people. The individual part of an algorithm is simply specific to your circumstances. Probably understanding the whole thing, may or may not help. Fraud? Yes, absolutely. If we can compare the public claims about an algorithm versus what it actually does, we can say, hey, this isn't nearly as accurate as you said it was in your marketing materials or when you promised investors that you would use it. Absolutely, audits can help us with fraud. Absolutely, they can help with discrimination. And I think that is one of their key uses. I've argued for them before in hiring, and I'm excited to talk about them in housing today. Absolutely, they can help reveal systemic discrimination algorithms. And systemic risks, maybe. And I want to mention why I think maybe, which is that typically when we talk about algorithm audits, we're talking about one specific company or one specific institution. Systemic risks often are split across many. And so you could imagine a sectorally wide audit, but that is maybe a step further than we're even considering here. But here we go again. So this is our algorithmic audits, a series of problems that we see and maybe how they help. So given this, what do we think an audit should be? These are broad thoughts, but the process considerations I think are maybe the most important. And the process here is not specifically what tests you run, but big picture, what does an audit need to be? The first two things I want to stress, independent and adversarial. Independent means a different organization that isn't financially bound to who it's auditing does this work. The second is that it's adversarial, which is to say that organization doesn't trust who they're auditing. And that's actually tricky because they're probably getting the data and the models from that company. You also want a representative audit. This is hard to think about, but modern companies, especially technology companies, they might have hundreds or thousands of models. And so you might not audit all of them, but you might say, okay, we're going to take a sample, a representative sample of their models and audit those. And then fourthly, in the process considerations, that your access is thorough. You have all the data and the code and the models that the company has, again, so you can make your own judgments about whether or not they're being fair and thorough and unbiased. I'm going to talk less about these next two because these are a little bit more technical elements, and we're going to hear more about it from the housing PPM framework in a second. But this is just to say that you want to consider the data, you want to consider any models that this is dependent on, that maybe they procured from somewhere else or used from an open source algorithm, that you want to think about the environment and the problem it's trying to solve, right? There's a lot of sort of technical elements you might think about what exactly an audit should be. But sticking with these first one, the independent adversarial, what does that tell us about who should do an audit? Because this isn't a particularly good issue. Some of the first auditors we've seen weren't really fully independent. And unfortunately, we saw an AI hiring company, HireVue, pay for an audit that was extraordinarily limited in what it could say and what access it had. And unfortunately, although they said it was an independent audit, it really functionally didn't end up doing that. It didn't end up really challenging the underlying systems that HireVue was selling, which many people have thought to be suspected discriminatory. And the takeaway from this is that audits are not automatically, they don't automatically mean accountability. We think of them, many people think of them in reference to accounting, but in accounting you have market incentives. That is, if you audit a company, if you're an auditor and the companies you audit keep going bankrupt, people might suspect that you're not a very good auditor. They have legal liability for the auditors themselves and direct government oversight. And it's that combination of things that really creates meaningful accountability through audits. It's not guaranteed, it's not automatic. And so my question when I ask why, it needs to be independent, it needs to be adversarial, they need extensive access to the data. And my challenge to NAFO, and I'm interested to hear what they think, is can civil liability do this? Can independent organizations do it? Rather than just governments? Because I will say we do know governments can do this. And I'll stop here in just a second, but governments can be independent. Usefully, fraud and discrimination are already often against the law. And governments can do this because they can hire for these, they can hire regulatory data scientists, they can develop best practices for the specific applications, they can gather information, enable consumer complaints, and then hopefully they can go collect this data from industry, and then actually run these systemic audits. So we kind of know governments can do this if we convince them to, though that they aren't necessarily, but we can convince them. Unfortunately, we're less sure if nonprofits can do this through civil liability. And again, I'm interested to hear from NAF on that. There is some more government action going on here. I will leave that for a future time, just to say that the housing and urban development and financial regulators have started to explore these issues, but have not done so much yet. And I'll stop there because I know I'm in danger of going over here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Alex. You can imagine your section actually generated a lot of questions, which I hope we're going to have enough time to go over those questions. And so I'll pass it on to Lisa to speak on why algorithmic auditing should be a requirement in housing. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Michael. And we certainly don't have enough time during this webinar to discuss all of the challenges that our society faces when it comes to using systems that can perpetuate disparities. But I'm just going to spend a few minutes. Next slide, please. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about just a few of the challenges that we face so that hopefully people get a sense of just how much work we have to do in this area. In some respects, we're behind the ball and we really need to play catch up. But there are stories really that abound, right, in the news and in the media about how algorithmic-based systems are discriminating against consumers and harming them. And in each story, each one of these stories, we sort of learn new ways that models are locking people out of critical opportunities or harming them, right? I think we all are aware of these examples and have seen them in the media, where Amazon, for example, built an AI tool to help them in their recruiting and hiring practices, but the system actually couldn't be deployed because the company discerned that it was discriminating against women. We saw in the healthcare field where millions of Black people over more than a decade have been negatively impacted by a widely used decision-making software system used by hospitals and other healthcare facilities. This system systematically discriminated against Black patients and was less likely to refer Black patients who were actually sicker and had more health issues than their white counterparts to much needed health services. And credit scoring systems, we've seen multiple studies that determine, that have shown that credit scoring systems that determine whether people can gain access to quality credit or what price they will pay for that credit can be discriminatory against women, people of color, and other underserved groups. Next slide, please. Apple made headlines after many women who reportedly had either the same financial profile or better financial profiles than their male partners were either being denied for credit or had lower access to credit, right? One of our member organizations in Connecticut is suing right now a major tenant screening selection service for potentially discriminating against people of color. And this is largely tied to the fact that people of color are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement officials and have more sort of criminal records than do their white counterparts. A couple of years ago, our lawsuit against Facebook for allegedly perpetuating bias against people of color and women and families with children made the headlines. We ultimately entered into a precedent-setting agreement with Facebook, now Meta, I better get that name right, in which the company Meta has developed a whole new platform for advertising, housing, employment, and credit ads. And the company has taken a number of steps to try to make its platforms fairer for consumers. Next slide, please. As Kareem mentioned, the use of technology is growing exponentially. I mean, it has really ticked up over the course of the healthcare crisis, the national COVID, the global COVID pandemic, from risk-based pricing systems to facial recognition systems. I won't tick all the way through them. You can see them there on the slides. But algorithmic models are using everything from people's biometric data to data that is housed in the credit repository systems to make really high stakes decisions about consumers. Next slide, please. And it's challenging because consumers even though we create the data or the data is emanating from us or is about us, we don't own the data, right? We as consumers don't get to say who gets to use our data, who can use our data, and how they can use it. But one of the other challenges that we face, particularly when it comes to the housing and financial services arena, is that much of the data used to build systems is tainted. It's dirty data. It's flawed data. That data is dirty. It's tainted because our markets are not fair. That data carries with it and reflects the bias and the discrimination, including the systemic inequities that are replete throughout our markets. Now, what you see before you is a depiction of the US dual credit market. On the blue side, that represents the financial mainstream. The yellow side represents the fringe market or the alternative financial services market. The blue side is very regulated. There are guidances and rules that direct how players have to treat consumers. Products are safer. They're highly monitored by our regulators. There are limits on the types of products that can be used. And there are parameters and guidances around how players have to use products or disseminate products into the marketplace. When consumers pay their debt, that positive information is reported to the credit repository agencies. Accessing credit on this side, on the blue side, is generally wealth building and in years to the benefit of the borrower. Now on the tan side, when borrowers pay their obligations on time, those positive payments, for the most part, are not reported to credit repository agencies. And in a very perverse arrangement, if a consumer accessing credit on the yellow side doesn't pay their debt on time and it goes to collections, the negative information does get reported. So when you're accessing credit on the yellow side, you perform well like you're supposed to, the positive information doesn't get picked up by any system that can see that you're a good consumer. But if you don't perform well, that negative information is picked up and can be seen by different players. The tan side is much less regulated, and products can often be predatory and abusive. Now, there's a major systemic failure here, and that is because of residential segregation. Most of the players on the blue side, that safer side, banks, credit unions, and the like, are hyper concentrated in predominantly white neighborhoods. Most of the players on the yellow side, on the other hand, are hyper concentrated in Black, Latino, and Native American neighborhoods. In fact, as we speak, banks are closing their branches in high income, affluent Black neighborhoods at a higher rate than they are in low income white neighborhoods. So this is not a matter of economics. It's a matter of race and segregation. People who access credit on the yellow side are more likely to face delinquency, not because the consumer is riskier, but because the products that they're accessing are more risky. People who are accessing credit on the yellow side are also more likely to be credit invisible, have a lower credit score, or not have a credit score at all. The data generated from this dual credit market, this bifurcated system, will be reflective of all of these systemic challenges and barriers that I just talked about, the inequities that exist within our society. And again, these inequities are not the consumer's fault. It's the fault of the system. It's the fault of the people who made and constructed the system. but yet the data from this flawed system gets tagged or appended to a consumer as if it's the consumer's fault. And this drives really deep structural disparities when this data is used in the algorithmic models that we build. Next slide, please. Models can perpetuate bias in myriad ways. The data is flawed or unrepresentative, as I just described to you, or the systems have design flaws, or there are biased feedback loops. I mean, there are many, many different ways that systems can be built to be unfair and ultimately end up harming consumers. Next slide, please. This is why it is imperative that we effectively audit systems to make them fairer, to compel them to be fairer when we're talking about legacy systems, or to ensure that we're building and developing fairer systems when it comes to those not yet built. By doing so, we can really help expand access to quality credit. We can help reduce the racial wealth and homeownership gaps. And finally, using state-of-the-art auditing frameworks can help the US be a leader in advancing responsible technologies that better serve markets, better serve consumers, and the greater society. I thank you for your attention, and Michael, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for walking us through why algorithmic auditing should be a requirement in housing. And so now is the time, after listening to Karim on on the basics of AI, and Alex on algorithmic auditing, what the current state is. I'm going to turn it over to Snigdha to speak on the very first component of the algorithmic auditing that NAFA has derived. Over to you, Snigdha.
Thank you so much, Michael. If we could just go to my slide, please. Next slide. Thank you, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Snigdha Sharma, and I am a tech equity analyst and FairOps team lead at NAFA. And I manage policy, research, and development requests that are related to tech equity from both within and outside NAFA. So now that we've gained a bit of an introduction to machine learning, AI auditing in general, and its use case in housing, I'd like to jump into the first stage of the PPM framework, the purpose stage. Next slide, please. So in order to fully understand the purpose stage, I'm going to start off by first setting up the landscape of what job exactly the PPM framework does, and then I'll delve into the actual explanation of the purpose stage. Next slide, please. So what is the job of the PPM framework, and what exactly does it hope to achieve? So the PPM framework is holistic in how it really tries to look at every stage of algorithmic solution development, as opposed to only the outcome, like a lot of other frameworks when assessing for fairness and bias. And we're hoping it can become a trust tool that regulators would one day be able to use to decide how fair or explainable an algorithmic system would be. Because, you know, as we've been hearing throughout this presentation, a lot of people think, oh, AI is a black box, meaning, you know, the input and, you know, the output, but we don't really know what happens in between to get that output. And so we want these algorithms that are often not understandable and explainable to be understandable and explainable to all, because if they're not, how will policymakers be able to call for methods to mitigate algorithmic risk to consumers? And if we're able to break the black box of algorithms by the use of our PPM framework, policymakers can then hold those entities developing algorithms accountable for really any decision they made while building the system. And that's really what the PPM framework does. The auditor examines and evaluates decisions developers are making while planning and developing the algorithmic solution to ensure they took appropriate measures to make the algorithm as unbiased, fair, and deliver the least amount of harm as possible. Next slide, please. So the first stage of the PPM framework is the purpose stage. And this is where you first examine the business problem that's trying to be solved through the use of an algorithmic solution. In order to present the business problem, I'm going to be talking about an example use case for the PPM framework. So in this case, the use case would be in the case of rental applications, specifically tenant scores. So in this instance, the business problem could be a landlord trying to determine who he should lease a unit to or not, because he's not sure if, which tenants will meet their rental obligations and which tenants won't. So first we have our input, the data that we would need to solve this problem. And this would be data such as application information, employment status, bank statements, etc. And this data would then be inputted into the black box, or in this case, classification algorithm. And this classification algorithm would have the output of the tenant score, which would be used to decide if an individual is given a lease or not. And the PPM framework use in this case would be auditing the algorithm. So for example, this classification algorithm that produces these tenant scores to see if the algorithm is fair, transparent, and explainable. Because if it's not, it's having very real consequences on people's lives. It's determining if they have access to housing or not. Next slide, please. So now that we have a general use case or examples of how the PPM framework would be used, we can go into explaining the first stage of the PPM framework, the purpose stage. So the purpose stage is composed of business understanding and data understanding. For the first aspect, business understanding, the objective is really to seek information so it's possible to make informed decisions about risks that the business problem can pose to everyone, from consumers to society at large. So for example, in my previous example, the business problem in a renting application would be who should be able to get a lease and who shouldn't. And so to gain an idea about the business problem, the auditor would look at the expectations, the requirements, and the objectives of the stakeholders, which in this case would be the landlords. And it's really important to examine all of these parts of the business problem and evaluate them before even beginning to form a solution such as the algorithmic model, because the reality here is that some systems shouldn't even be built or put into production. So, by asking ourselves these questions right off the bat, we can sometimes prevent negative harm from ever even reaching these consumers. Next slide, please. So now that we've examined the business problem, we need to see if we have the data to represent this business problem, which is the second aspect of the purpose stage, data understanding. So here we need to see if the data is representative, along with is the data sufficient, and if it's not, were there any techniques that were used to mitigate risks associated with data quality or insufficient data? So for example, in a lending application, for mortgage approval or denial, this is where the credit invisible would be brought up, because based on the data the automated underwriting algorithm uses, there's no data to represent them. So how fair would the algorithm be really? Next slide, please. So for any use case, it's important the data is representative, because if it's not, it can pose major threats to the fairness of a model, given both the historical and current inequities in the US market. We have known issues such as, redlining and segregation, which leads to people of color being underrepresented in data. And so, this is what the purpose stage really tries to account for in the PPM framework. These common data issues by seeking answers to questions such as, is there proxy testing for protected classes, and what metrics are going to be used? So, now that we've examined the business problem to solve and the representativeness of the data used to solve the business problem, we can go on to evaluate the actual design and logic of the algorithmic solution in the process section, which John will go on to explain. Thank you.
Thank you, Snigdha, for showing how the PPM framework covers the environment, the inputs that go into the black box or machine learning models, just like Alex covered during his section. So John, over to you to speak on the process component of the PPM framework. Over to you, John.
You're on mute.
Let me try
John,
that again. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Merrill, CTO and co-founder of Fairplay.ai. I provide technical support to NAFA's Tech Equity Initiative, and I'm here today to talk about the process portion of the PPM framework. Let me start with an anecdote. Now, a 2015 study showed that Google Photos routinely labeled the images of Black men as gorillas. Now, let's be clear, that was very embarrassing, yes, but photo recognition is an extraordinarily hard problem. People have been working on it since the advent of computers, and the marvel is not that Google's algorithm failed, but that it worked at all. And I'd be stunned if there weren't other ways to fool it. But this is particularly troubling because the GAO testified in 2021 that at least 42 different federal law enforcement agencies were using facial recognition in decisions including prediction of recidivism in suspect location and in other sensitive uses. And this calls into a bunch of questions. You know, how accurate is facial recognition technology? Not terribly. How fair is it? Not. And what are the appropriate and inappropriate uses of the technology? And that's a question that we need to answer. The process component of the PPM framework looks to capture issues like this during the active development phase of the system by describing an audited process before such systems are put into production. It breaks the problem into 5 major considerations: staff profile, data assessment, model assessment, outcome assessment, and model use and limitation. Next slide, please. The PPM specifies several aspects of each of these considerations, which should be audited, and lists points every such audit should examine. I shall address each of these in turn. Next slide, please. Staffing. Every audit should ensure that any entity building an algorithmic system to make a high-stakes decision has ensured that the team is diverse, that it is well educated in both technical and non-technical issues, and can communicate well both within itself and with other stakeholders. Is the team diverse? Does it contain members whose age, gender, race, or other properties reflect a wide spectrum of people, particularly those from underserved groups? Now notice that this is put in the process stage, although it applies at all stages in the auditing process, from deciding what design objectives should be fulfilled to the period that the algorithm is in production. Is the team educated? Even though there are many commercially and non-commercially available systems for building candidate algorithms, blind application of such systems is likely to lead to candidate algorithms which perform less well than expected. All members of the team, whether considered technical or not, need to have a solid understanding about the general risks and benefits of different kinds of algorithmic systems, how learning algorithms are built, how they're evaluated, and how they're used. In addition, these systems will provide high-stakes results, and they can easily exhibit unfair behavior which violates the privacy of users or which violates other expectations of consumer protection. So members of the team also need to be educated in such non-technical domains. It's not enough to have data scientists and engineers who can build high-quality models. It's essential that they also understand the other constraints of the algorithmic systems that they're building. Finally, can the team communicate? No amount of diversity or technical and non-technical expertise is adequate if the members of the team cannot communicate requirements and outcomes internally, or cannot communicate those results to external stakeholders. Diversity in a team will be valueless if people's voices aren't heard. And the team's successes will be meaningless if they cannot be communicated to external stakeholders. So to reiterate, every audit should ensure that any entity building an algorithmic system to make a high-stakes decision has ensured that the team is diverse, that it is well educated, and that it communicates well. Next slide, please. Data assessment. Any audit must examine whether all the data used in building the algorithmic system was collected legally and ethically, whether it was a representative sample of the total population to which the algorithm was to be applied, whether the data was accurate, or if not, whether that invalidated the algorithmic system, whether the data is well behaved, both with regard to variables used in running the system and with any variables used in training the system, and whether any data pre-processing is reasonable. Was the data collected in an ethical and legal fashion? Was it collected legally? For instance, were the persons contributing to it allowed to do so? In addition, were the persons contributing it aware of how it was being used? If not, then it may not have been collected legally. Was it collected ethically? Were users adequately informed of the amount and type of data collected and what its retention policies would be? As an aside, the FTC has begun acting directly against entities who build algorithmic systems using data in inappropriate ways, which adds to the risk occasioned by using such data. Is the data appropriate to the use for which it is being put? There needs to be a reasonable relationship between the purpose of the system and the data used to construct the system. For instance, it's possible to extract extensive credit-related data from a cell phone number. But the relationship between cell phone number, which is effectively 10 random digits, and the credit risk of the applicant is pretty tenuous. So any use of that information should be viewed with extreme caution. Is the data representative of the population to which the model is to be applied? If one is training an algorithmic system to, say, underwrite loans, but only 1/50th of the input records reflect Black applicants, even though half of the applicants are Black, then the system is likely to be less accurate on Black applicants than a system trained on a more balanced system. Alternatively, if a system is trained on a sample which reflects Black applicants who are being treated in a disparate fashion, say by being given a higher interest rate, then the system is likely to incorrectly assign higher risk to Black applicants due to its unrepresentative nature. Is the data accurate? Models built on inaccurate data are built on shifting sand. They may be accurate in spite of the data, but they are intrinsically less trustworthy than models built on accurate data. As a rule, any system built on inaccurate data should be looked at askance. And this is not a purely hypothetical concern. In a recent study run by Consumer Reports, it was found that more than 1/3 of all consumers found at least one major error in their credit reports, which necessarily means that credit models built on such credit reports could well be unreliable. Finally, is the data well behaved? The data here includes both input data, which will be used during production, and target data, which will be used to train the model. In general, target data refers to some quantity which captures the design objective, but it may also refer to other data, which might, for instance, capture a constraint on the system. As far as the input data is concerned, the key concerns are missingness, how often a given column has no value, or availability during production, whether the data value will actually be available during production, or suitability for purpose, which reflects other constraints, such as being a proxy for a protected class. In the part of training data, the questions arise largely from missingness and imbalance. Is one class more likely to be predicted than another? Or is the distribution of values to be predicted, say, if you're looking at an annual percentage rate, is that distribution flat or very skewed? And finally, is any data pre-processing reasonable? Most models will use data which requires some amount of pre-processing. Data may need to be normalized or some kind of derived feature made from it. And most models will also include some other collection of hand-built features. Any audit must consider whether any such constructed features are reasonable and if they have a plausible relationship to the problem being solved. Again, to reiterate, any audit must examine whether all data used in building the predictive system was collected ethically and legally, whether it was representative, whether it was accurate, whether it was well behaved, and whether it was processed in a reasonable manner. It looks like I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to speed up quite a bit. I'm sorry. Model assessment. Each audit must determine and document Thank you. That was very kind of you for flipping the slide there. Must determine and document how plausible the system's parameters are. In particular, how much the system is overtrained, how plausible the system's hyperparameters are, and how fair the system is. Different types of algorithmic systems have different strengths and weaknesses. Linear and logistic regressions are stable and simple, but they make some very restrictive assumptions about the structure of the data. In contrast, very general models, such as gradient boosting machines or neural networks or random forests, can be applied to very complicated data sets and can find patterns in the data, but do so at the cost of potential instability and poorer performance on data they were trained on. In addition, each model is built using a process which has its own parameters called hyperparameters, things like learning rate, network architecture, forest size, and similar. It's necessary to validate that those aren't unreasonable, because if they are, the resulting system may well perform badly in production. I'm going to start by talking about hyperparameters here. Every model training system has a set of tuning parameters. These are referred to as hyperparameters. They include obvious hyperparameters like learning rate and the number of iterations for a regression and neural network, but also the target loss function, which may not just reflect an desired outcome, but also extra additional terms which smooth or compensate for unfairness in the original data. This leads us to the question of fairness. Systems which make high stakes decisions need to be as fair as possible. Consider the hypothetical credit scoring problem we mentioned above. The bias that arises from the training set is unacceptable, and teams building such systems must avoid using such instances of unfairness for protected classes. This will not be the case unless the team building the model takes steps to ensure this happens. There are two major approaches to solving this problem. The first is to guarantee that the training set is as representative of the actual underlying population. But that might be possible. So in addition, the team building the system needs to look at the system as a whole and its performance on test data and look for the best model given fairness constraints. As a rule, there's a trade-off between the degree to which the system meets its design objective and the fairness of the model. The fairest system will tend to have low accuracy, and the most accurate system, the one that best meets its design or business objective, will have low fairness. The best system, then, will be a Goldilocks model. Not too accurate, so it's not unfair. Not too fair, so it's not inaccurate. This entails a principled search for a least discriminatory alternative, which best balances the design objectives of the system against the fairness objectives of the system. To repeat, each audit must determine and document how plausible the system parameters are, how plausible the system's hyperparameters are, and how fair the system is, and in particular, whether a search for a less discriminatory alternative has been performed. I'm going to really hurry up because I am running short of time. Next slide, please. Output assessment. The analysis of a model pre-deployment is not enough. The model must perform well in production. Obviously, we can't do that during the pre-deployment phase, but we can take steps to make it more likely that it will. Every audit of a high-stakes decision system must evaluate whether the decision system is accurate, fair, explainable, and both stable and robust. It's obvious what it means by asking if the model is accurate, although the mechanism for measuring accuracy can be quite subtle, and I'll be happy to answer questions about that after the talk. Is the model fair? We've talked about that extensively. The model has to be a result of an LDA search, but even that may not be fair enough. During outcomes assessment, this needs to be examined and measured. And is the model explainable? Any model which is to be applied to a high-stakes decision must be explainable to the organization as a whole, to any regulatory models, and to any users who wish to understand any decisions it makes. And finally, is the model stable and robust? Accuracy and fairness mean nothing if the results of applying the model are unstable, or if the small perturbations in the input variables will generate large swings in the outputs. To recap, every audit of a high-stakes decisioning system must evaluate whether the decisioning system is accurate, fair, explainable, and both stable and robust. Finally, I want to spend a little more time on the last segment, model use and limitations, and particularly on one point. Each PPM audit of a decisioning system must document whether the system is being used in accordance with the essential limitations of the system itself, being applied to problems for which is appropriate, and in a thing which is often not called out, but which needs to be, being operated in accordance with a set of anomaly handling procedures and protocols, which are routinely practiced and are updated regularly to account for new anomalies. The first two of these make sense and are probably well thought about. The last one is often obscure. The thing is, things break, and you never need a protocol or a process to handle things break until they do. So every application needs a runbook that includes handling such emergencies and which is extended as new emergencies arise. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for covering how the PPM framework attempts to mystify the process component of any algorithmic solution. So I'll quickly present on the last component of the framework, which is the monitoring element. Can you please go to the next slide? Next slide, please. Yeah, so just like the previous speaker, John, mentioned, so one of the key components of the process element of the PPM framework is model use and limitations. So the PPM framework requires documentation of the business problem for which algorithmic system is designed so that the scope of use is clear to model users. So for example, we've seen when Snigdha presented, so there was an application of machine learning models to tenant scoring. So the underlying data, as well as the business objective, which in this case is tenant scoring, defines circumstances where the model may or may not be used. And they also impose limitations or constraints on the algorithmic system. So this model use and model blind spots, they need to be closely monitored as soon as the model is in a production environment. And that is why the PPM framework is advocating for gathering or collection of documentations as well as metrics about what plans are in place to ensure that the models that are being deployed are actually monitored once they are in production environment. Next slide, please. So PPM is holistic and comprehensive, and it is also consumer-centered. So we believe any algorithm auditing framework that aims at zero risk to consumers should answer three questions. So first, the question is, can we ensure algorithmic systems are equitable and trustworthy? And that is covered comprehensively under the purpose section of the framework. The second question is, can a process that creates algorithmic systems be safe and socially beneficial? And as we listen to John, we see that that question is answered if the right documentation of fact or evidence are collected using the process component of the PPM framework. And the last question that an algorithmic auditing framework should answer is, can we allow algorithmic artifacts to continue to augment human decision-making or continue to take actions after their deployment? This last question is covered in the monitoring component of the PPM framework. So the monitoring component aims at assuring that the developed model behaves as expected while being used to make business decisions. It checks if guardrails sufficient for preempting privacy breach and algorithmic deterioration are in place. So the common saying is that, once you develop the model, then you probably need to wave your hand and maybe not even pay attention to the damages that those models are causing. But with our framework, we're saying that we know that all models are wrong, some are useful, and for us to actually continue to have confidence in the value or the usefulness of the deployed algorithms, it is essential for businesses to monitor their models. So the goal of the monitoring component is to gather data that can inform decisions about if the model would need to be retrained or even retired if necessary. So in conclusion, the PPM framework reduces any algorithmic system into 3 stages, that is purpose, process, and monitoring, to ensure consumers can participate in a fair and competitive market that is free from bias. The National Fair Housing Alliance has developed an algorithm auditing framework that builds off existing guidance and also presents a new gold standard. The framework provides a roadmap for regulators, businesses, civil rights groups, academics, researchers, and other stakeholders to assess the fairness and efficacy of algorithmic systems to lessen or eradicate harmful effects of algorithmic solutions on society. Now that we have explained how the PPM framework collects and gathers documentation for an algorithmic system, we now go on to take questions that we have received to date. So please keep the questions coming, and I'll quickly go through some of the questions that we have here, and many of them will be posted on NAFA website under our FAQs so that listeners can actually follow up. The first question that I have here, I'm going to pose them to Karim as well as Lisa. So what would motivate a company to use the PPM framework? Meaning, what is the incentive, given what Alex presented about algorithmic auditing, which covers not only the outcome or the output, so it looks at the environment, the context, it looks at the input as well as the functions. What incentives are there for businesses to allow frameworks like PPM to be applied to the algorithmic system? Karim and Lisa, over to you.
Lisa, please.
I was going to let you go first, Karim. So there are a number of incentives. I'll just list one, and that is ensuring that companies are in compliance with civil rights laws. We've seen from a number of lawsuits that have been brought by civil rights groups down through the decades, and I'm pointing to some of the insurance redlining cases that NAFA and other fair housing groups brought that challenged allegedly discriminatory insurance scoring systems up until some of the recent litigation that I talked about earlier. Litigation under civil rights laws can come with a really stiff sticker price. And no organization wants to be found liable of having violated a civil rights law and discriminating against consumers. So using an effective, comprehensive, holistic monitoring, auditing framework can help companies avoid liability under civil rights laws.
Yeah, I would add to that, I think there's at least 3 incentives that I perceive for using the PPM framework, right? I think the PPM framework is for folks who want the economic, regulatory, and reputational dividends of being fair, right? The PPM framework ensures that the models perform as intended. They ensure that they are fair to the consumers they serve. That allows folks to find more good applicants and treat them fairly. That yields both a regulatory dividend, as Lisa suggested, by shielding them from liability, but also a reputational dividend of being able to say to regulators, your stakeholders, your customers in the world, that you have taken best-in-class steps to ensure the decisioning systems in use by your organization don't pose a threat either to the consumers they serve or to the safety and soundness of your institution or the financial system.
Thank you so much, Karim. My next question goes to Alex. So when it comes to big data or machine learning, the usual perception is that these systems actually propagate inequalities or inequities. So when it comes to the PPM framework, how can a holistic algorithmic auditing like NAFA's PPM framework reduce perceived inequalities associated with big data or machine learning? Over to you, Alex.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. So yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that the use of an algorithm can make things better, right? It is not categorically true that using an algorithm just creates discrimination. I earlier said that is worth assuming it might, but it's still not categorically true, right? So that's the first thing, is when you hear algorithm, you might think this is definitely discriminatory. It's probably discriminatory, not that that's much better. And then the other side of that coin is it may be better than what was there before. There has been, in hiring, for instance, a recent literature review that said discrimination against African Americans didn't get better over decades of hiring. And it's possible that using algorithms could actually improve things. Again, we shouldn't assume we should run these tests and evaluations to make sure that's the case. And so the first step is, do we know if they're better or not? And this is why we talk about independent audits. Most companies, if you go to their website and they're selling an algorithmic tool, they will say things like 100% unbiased, right? Right there on the website. And we did actually see the FTC warn these companies that said, hey, you really shouldn't be making claims like that. We kind of don't believe you and we may come after you. And the FTC has started considering a rulemaking process, which might let them go after some of these companies for fraud and discrimination. 5 financial regulators have also done that, and they specifically mentioned the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act as 2 of the reasons they started to do that. So when we talk about audits, first it's discovery. Is this definitely discriminatory, right? We suspect, but we shouldn't assume. And then the second step is, yeah, that's against the law in housing under the Fair Housing Act, under Equal Credit Act, and many other existing laws. And so that's when hopefully organizations like NAFA can bring civil liability to punish companies for not spending enough on making sure their algorithms are fair, or, as I mentioned before, fines and penalties from agencies. So, I think it should be discovery, and then if they're discriminatory, a punishment, right? That's how we systemically solve this problem.
Thank you so much, Alex. I wish we have enough time to go over lots of other questions that we've received, but we'll be sure to address those questions and then post them on our website. So having said that, thank you for your participation in today's webinar. We hope that you will join us for our next webinar. Please check out the NAFA website for a description and important information on registration for upcoming events. Please also connect with the National Fair Housing Alliance on our social media platforms, such as Twitter and LinkedIn, for insights and information about upcoming events, especially those related to the use of algorithms in housing. Thanks to everyone who made today's event possible, and I wish everyone the best of the rest of the day. Thank you.